The Detroit Lions are at one of the most fascinating crossroads in the entire NFL right now. And what makes this moment so compelling is not just what they've done this offseason, but what they haven't done. This is a team that entered the year with expectations, belief, and a growing identity under head coach Dan Campbell and general manager Brad Holmes. And yet the moves we've seen in free agency have left a lingering question hanging over this franchise. Are the Lions building towards something sustainable, or are they quietly taking a step backward at the worst possible time? Because when you really step back and look at the full picture, the Lions didn't just tweak their roster. They reshaped it in a way that feels subtle on the surface, but potentially massive underneath. The departures alone tell a story. Veterans like David Montgomery, Taylor Decker, and Graham Glasgow weren't just names on a depth chart. They were structural pieces, tone setters, and in some cases, identity drivers for what Detroit wanted to be physically and stylistically. Losing that kind of presence doesn't always show up immediately on paper, but it shows up in the trenches, in late-game drives, and in moments where cohesion matters more than talent. And that's where the concern begins to creep in. Because while the Lions did bring in replacements, the question isn't whether they added players. It's whether they added the right kind of players to sustain a system that was already fragile after a 9-8 season. Take a player like Isaiah Pacheco, for example. There's explosiveness there, there's energy, there's upside. But replacing a bruising, consistent force like Montgomery with a different stylistic back changes the rhythm of the offense. It forces adjustments, not just for the running game, but for play action, for pass protection, for how defenses choose to attack Detroit week to week. And that pattern repeats across the roster. Tyler Conklin at tight end brings reliability, but not necessarily game-breaking ability. Greg Dortch adds speed. But does he command attention the way a true outside threat would? Even defensively, additions like DJ Wonnum and Peyton Turner feel more like calculated gambles than definitive upgrades. Turner, in particular, represents one of the clearest examples of the Lions' current philosophy. A former first-round talent, physically gifted, but plagued by injuries and inconsistency, now signed to a deal that carries virtually no risk. That contract tells you everything about how Brad Holmes is operating right now. This is not a front office swinging for the fences in free agency. This is a front office trying to find value, trying to uncover upside, and trying to avoid long-term damage. And in isolation, that's smart. But in context, for a team that's trying to contend, it raises a different kind of question. Are the Lions being too cautious at a time when aggression might be required? Because the reality is, even the contracts that do carry some level of commitment come with concerns. Cade Mays is the perfect example. On paper, a 3-year deal worth up to $25 million doesn't sound outrageous in today's NFL. But when you dig deeper, you see a player who hasn't firmly established himself as a full-time starter, who is still relatively new to the center position, and who now carries expectations that may not align with his current level of play. Paying near top 10 center money to a player still developing at the position is not just a financial risk. It's a structural one. If that position falters, it impacts everything from quarterback comfort to run game efficiency. And that's what makes this offseason so polarizing. The Lions didn't make one glaring mistake. They made a series of calculated bets. And history tells us that not all of those bets are going to hit. Larry Borum's deal, while modest, still raises questions about whether he can truly anchor depth at a critical position. May's contract could look like a bargain if he develops, or a misstep if he doesn't. These are the margins where seasons are decided. Right here is where you start to see the broader picture come into focus. This isn't just about individual signings. This is about roster philosophy. This is about whether Detroit believes its core is strong enough to elevate mid-tier additions, or whether they've underestimated how much elite talent matters in today's NFL. And if you're enjoying this kind of deep breakdown, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because we're going to keep unpacking every move, every decision, and every ripple effect as the Lions push toward what could be one of the most defining seasons in recent franchise history. Now let's talk about the bigger question that's hovering over everything. Are the Detroit Lions still legitimate Super Bowl contenders? Because that's the standard now. That's the expectation that's been built over the last few seasons. And yet, when you look at the current roster compared to last year, it's difficult to argue that they've clearly improved. But here's where things get interesting. Improvement in the NFL doesn't always come from external additions. Sometimes it comes from internal growth. Younger players taking the next step, coaches refining their systems, health swinging back in your favor after a season filled with injuries. These are variables that don't show up in off-season headlines, but they often define the trajectory of a team. And under Dan Campbell, this is a team that has consistently leaned into development. The culture in Detroit isn't built around quick fixes. It's built around toughness, continuity, and belief. That matters, especially when you consider how close the margins are between being a fringe playoff team and a legitimate contender. At the same time, you can't ignore the reality of the NFC landscape. Other contenders are making moves. Other teams are evolving. Standing still, or even appearing to stand still, can be just as dangerous as making the wrong move. The Lions are betting that their foundation is strong enough to withstand that pressure, that their identity can carry them through a season where the roster might not look as intimidating on paper. And then there's the element of organizational stability. Despite rumors suggesting tension between Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, the message from inside the building has been clear. Alignment, unity, a shared vision. Holmes has been adamant that any perceived intensity is simply the result of a deeper evaluation process after falling short of expectations. And if that's true, it could actually be a positive sign. Great teams don't shy away from hard conversations. They lean into them. Still, perception matters. And when a team has a relatively quiet or underwhelming free agency period, speculation fills the void. Fans start to question direction. Analysts start to poke holes. That's the reality of the NFL spotlight. Even the smaller stories surrounding the team add to this sense of transition. The retirement of former wide receiver DJ Chark is a reminder of how quickly careers and chapters can close in this league. His time in Detroit was brief, impacted by injury, and ultimately just a small piece of a larger journey. But it reflects a broader truth about the Lions. This is a team that has been constantly cycling through pieces, searching for the right combination to unlock sustained success. And outside of the roster, the organization itself continues to evolve. Owner Sheila Hamp expanding her influence into global sports ventures signals a franchise that is growing not just on the field, but as a business entity. That kind of leadership stability and vision can have long-term ripple effects, even if it doesn't show up directly in the win column. Then you have the league itself evolving. New rule proposals, including one that could allow officials to intervene in real time on missed disqualifications, stem from situations that teams like Detroit have experienced firsthand. These changes might seem minor, but they shape the environment in which teams compete. They influence outcomes, strategies, and even how games are officiated in critical moments. All of this comes together to paint a picture of a team in transition, but not in decline. The Lions are not rebuilding. They are recalibrating. And that distinction is crucial, because a recalibration assumes that the foundation is already in place. It assumes that the core is strong enough to absorb change without collapsing. The real question is whether that assumption is correct. Because if players like Cade Mays exceed expectations, if rotational gambles like Peyton Turner finally unlock their potential, if the offensive identity adapts successfully to its new pieces, then this offseason will look brilliant in hindsight. It will look disciplined, strategic, and forward-thinking. But if those bets miss, if the losses outweigh the gains, if the cohesion that once defined this team starts to crack, then this will be remembered as the offseason where the Lions hesitated when they should have attacked. And that's what makes this moment so compelling. The margin between success and regret is razor thin. So as we head toward the draft and into the heart of the offseason, keep your eyes on how this team continues to build. Because the story of the 2026 Detroit Lions is far from finished. In many ways, it's just beginning to take shape. If you want to stay ahead of every development, every roster move, and every strategic shift, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is going to be a season where every decision matters more than ever.